Okay, let's begin building up the values. By now, I'm sure this is a process you're very familiar with, so I'm going to continue to speed things up for this lesson. If you find that I'm going too fast for you, just pause your video and catch up. I know you can't wait to draw all those stray hairs, but you must resist the urge. Stray hairs go in dead last. Even the eyelashes go in before them. Stick to the program. It's going to take a lot of layering to build an area this large up to ninth or 10th value, so just take your time and keep hatching over it. I'm going to work some information in around her part and define it a little, so I don't lose it in my shading. I'm making sure to leave the area where the highlights are going to go almost empty. Don't put hair in until later, just outline the shape of the highlight and shade a value around it. The direction of the hairs I'm putting in doesn't matter. This will all be under layers of shading. Just be sure not to lose the shape of the highlight. Once the value of the hair is built up to ninth value, I'll go back into the highlight and put in hair texture and detail with a lighter lead. I'm going to switch to a B lead to build up the shadow on her forehead. It may not be a soft enough lead to get the value dark enough, but I'm going to give it a try because I want the texture of her skin to appear as smooth as possible, and to do that it's best to keep the pencil grain to a minimum. Another reason for using a B lead instead of a 2B is because the value next to this one on her forehead is going to be shaded with an H lead, and the texture from the B will transition into the H much more smoothly than a 2B. Since I'm working on this year, it seems like a good time to talk about some of the rules of portrait art. These rules universally apply to drawing, painting, or even photographing a portrait. The first rule is managing the focal point. Information like the ears and the hairline should be softer or more out of focus, while the eyes, nose, and lips should be sharper or more in focus. Doing this creates depth of field, which makes your portrait feel more dimensional and dynamic. This is going to be something you control, despite what you see in the photo reference. So even if her earlobe or hairline looks like a hard line, you should still soften them. The second rule is the highlights on the subject's eyes, nose, and lips should be the brightest. Even if your photo reference has brighter highlights in her hair or somehow her ears, this is an artistic freedom you take. This is how you control where the viewer's eyes look first when viewing your art. It may be too subtle for the untrained eye to notice, but on a subconscious level it feels better to look at. And it's attention and control like this that makes a portrait go from good to great. And if you look at any portraits done by history's greatest artists, you'll find these rules being obeyed. Make sure you don't lose your highlights in the shading. I'm just bringing them back out with my sharpened eraser. This side of the white part of her eyeball gets pretty dark. I'm guessing about fourth value, so I'll put that in with the B lead. I'll save the other side of her eye for the H. Next, I'll put in some of the mid-tone eyebrow hair texture. On second thought, since this is hair, I'll use a 2B lead. The value on her neck and face are very similar. At this point, you should be treating them as one plane and shading right across any boundary lines. We'll define them more as the values get closer. In the meantime, it's best to build the neck and face up at the same pace to keep the continuity. I'm switching to a 2B to put midtones into her eyebrow. Again, I'm doing my best to build all of the values on her face in unison. Again, don't put in every loose eyebrow hair in detail yet. Save that for after you've finished establishing the overall value of her skin, same as the eyelashes. Careful not to make this line too dark. I know at first glance it seems like it should be 10th value, but it's actually about 7th value. Be sure to keep the highlights as bright as possible. I think this area could be a bit lighter. I may have let it get too dark. I'm trying to shade around this lighter strip above her eyelid, but if you have trouble with it, you can always shade a value over the whole area and erase the lighter strip with your sharpened eraser. Sometimes doing it that way actually looks better. Make sure all of these highlights line up. Remember, they're all from the same light source. See this highlight on her forehead, this highlight in her eye, eyelid, and cheek? That's all from one light bulb. So, this highlight should line up with this highlight in her left eye, because they're from the same light source. Making sure your highlights line up will give your drawing continuity. The more you learn to think about an image with this organization, the more organized it becomes in your mind. That order will resonate in your drawings. You won't just be copying what you're seeing in a reference, you'll be controlling it. It's not difficult to do, just something to pay attention to at first. The more you get into the practice of looking for it, the easier it'll get. I'll just keep pointing it out to you, and hopefully by the end of this course it will have clicked for you. I'm just going to take a moment to make sure I'm getting her likeness in her eyes. I think I'm pretty close. Before I move down to the nose and lips, I'm going to put a value into the other side of her hair. As you can see, there's a set of highlights on this side. These are easy to handle, just lightly outline them and shade around them for now. As I said, you can shade in the direction of the hair if it helps, but it really doesn't matter what direction your pencil lines are going in, because you're going to shade over this many more times as you build the value up. Do your best not to let the part in her hair get lost in the shading. Okay, I'm going to switch to a B-lead and start putting in some shading on and around her nose. It's hard to tell if I need to make any alterations until those values are in. Right now it's so light that it's making her other features seem very strong by comparison. As I approach this side of her nose, I should mention this is a tricky area because of the reflected light, like this, inside the shadow. The best advice I can give you is this. Isolate the area in your mind, simplify it by looking for simple shapes, and give them a flat value. I'll outline the shapes to help you see them. Now just make the shadow fourth value, and the lighter areas or reflected light third value. I know it's easier said than done, and it takes some practice to learn how to see those shapes, but visualization is the key to drawing, painting, playing a sport, really anything you want to master. Okay, I know this is subtle, but I think it's important to the shape of this area. You see where this lightness comes into the shadow here? I'm just going to erase the work I've done and put it back in with a lighter value and manage the transition better. I'm just going to quickly switch to a sharpened eraser to try to get this little highlight under her nose in. And I'm going to fix the shape of this nostril a little. I'll switch to an H-LED for this. I'm just going to put a flat value right over this whole midtone on her nose. Just go right over the highlights. We'll go back later and extract them with the sharpened eraser. The shading in this area is going to be relatively light, so I need to reduce the line from my preliminary drawing. But I don't want to lose it completely, so I'm just going to dab it with a rubber eraser. You're going to see me doing that every so often on this side of her face, especially to the outlines around highlights. I'm going to switch back to a B-lead for the nostril. I know it's 10th value, but the reason I'm not going to use a 2B lead is because I want the nostrils to be slightly lighter. This loops back to the rules to drawing a portrait I explained earlier. The pupil should be the darkest value on your drawing. When a viewer looks at this portrait, the first place I want their eyes to go is her eyes, not her nostrils. For this area, don't draw in the texture from the pores, just shade in a flat value. If you're having trouble estimating what value it is, it helps to squint your eyes at the area. Doing that makes it easier to see the average value. Okay, back to a 2B lead, and let's begin working on her lips. Don't put in any detail yet, just bring them up to about the same value as her hair. Your shading doesn't have to be perfect at this point, but it is important to get the structure right. Just visualize the lips broken up into planes, then shade in a value for each plane. Notice there's a plane under her lips as well. That's still part of the structure. Putting the lips in helped. It's starting to look like her. This tiny line of rim light is actually very important. It makes her chin feel rounded instead of flat, and will play a part in getting her likeness, so be sure to give it a little extra attention and don't let it get lost in your shading. Continue shading the side of her neck into the shading on the side of her face. That will keep her head from looking detached. A problem I'm noticing is that her jawline is too dark. It's making her jaw seem too dominant, so I'm going to erase it and reshade the area. Okay, and that's a good first round of shading.